Niall is Director of the Masters in Translation Ulster University Magee campus and spent 5 years as President of Conrad na Gaeilge. During this time, he was heavily involved in raising awareness for Irish language rights and promoting the language as a shared heritage. His main interest research are on onomastics and Irish and the educational system in Ireland. Niall has been continuously involved in collaboration with Reclaim the Enlightenment from celebrating the 1792 Harp Assembly. So, Niall, if you'd like to come forward.
Thanks very much, Terry. Before I start, I suppose, because everybody else has been given their own educational background, I am product of the grammar school system, that huge sort of academic snobbery that existed. Went to primary school, went on to the grammar school that was attached to it in Newry, as did all my brothers, as did all my people before me and cousins. But then when I had my own children, we decided for them not to do the 11 plus, and it turned out that they actually, if we're measuring achievement by results, they did better than anybody. So it just shows you that, the system doesn't work or does work. It just depends on you yourself. However, that's not what I'm here to talk about today. So firstly, just going way so chree, the Cushty Reclaim the Enlightenment, as an Carusho Hortu. I'm very, very pleased to be here. And I want to thank my friends in Reclaim the Enlightenment and those people I've got to know over the past number of years for inviting me here to talk today. So I suppose over the past number of years, I've given a number of talks about the subject matter in hand, Irish and education, and Irish and the education system. And mostly these talks have been accused of having, a single transferable lecture, and that has been true in a number of occasions. But these talks and subsequent articles have outlined the historic neglect of the language in our school system and the politically motivated efforts to eradicate the language in schools. As there's this common misconception that the Irish language was abandoned by the Irish people and by the public, and that it was destined to fail anyway. That's not the case, but that's a discussion for another day. So before I move on to the main subject of today's talk, which is about Irish in the school system now and how we move forward, I do think I would like to give a brief overview about the fortunes of the Irish language, particularly in the North and within the context of the partition of Ireland. The historical context, a close analysis of the 1911 census shows that Irish was spoken as a community language in 3 areas in the North. Now, there were native speakers still everywhere, in practically every county in Ireland at this stage. But bilingualism as a community language, practiced by 30% or so of the community, was still in existence in the Sperrins and in the Red Bay, sort of Cushendall area, and Rathlin Island. Rathlin Island was bilingual until, I suppose, the 1940s, etc. After 1911, there's very little information, but it's clear that the decline of the speaking of Irish as a community language was happening. Okay, we know this. It was happening throughout Ireland. It was happening in the northern part of the county, but it was still a community language. It was still being spoken. Efforts had been made by Conrad na Gaeilge, or the Gaelic League. It's an organisation that was set up in the 1890s by Douglas Hyde, who would go on to be the first president of Ireland. He was the son of a Church of Ireland minister, and Hyde had a very, very forward-thinking vision of how the language should have its part. But Conrad na Gaeilge was set up to address or to stop the decline in the language, and part of that was to look about how the language could be integrated into the education system. We've talked about, a previous speaker talked about, the national school system. The national school system was one of the reasons it was set up, was to eradicate the Irish language from the system. Anybody who's read any Irish language literature will know how English language speakers only were sent into the schools in the Gaeltacht areas, and children were regularly chastised and beaten because they wouldn't speak English with a tally stick. So every time they spoke Irish, there was a tally put on the stick, they were beaten in school, then it was brought home and the punishment was doubled. Anyway, that's a slight tangent. So anyway, Conor na Gaeilge had been making efforts all over Ireland to stop this decline. But by the time the new state was established in 1922, the hostility of unionism towards the Irish language grew more than it had been previously. It was clear the Irish language would not be welcome in the new state that was established. It can be said, therefore, that there were additional factors related to the pressure on the language in the 6 counties that would become Northern Ireland, or the 2/3 of Ulster, whatever way you want to call it. I don't really care what you refer to it as. But these reasons provoked this sort of dynamic of decline, and now there was a government that was hostile towards the language. Unlike the 26 counties, which would be the Republic of Ireland, the Irish language had no official status in the new state. The language was considered of no importance in terms of education, and a memorandum in 1928 reflects the attitudes of the Ministry of Education in the North, who stated, "We should carefully avoid any impression that we desire to encourage the teaching of the language." So in the 1920s, there was a significant change in the education system in Ireland with the partition of the country. In the years before partition, and due to pressure from Conor na Gaeilge, as I mentioned, the government, the government that had been based in Dublin, Irish had got a certain status within the education system. It had been reintroduced from, I suppose, the early 1900s onwards. It was far from perfect, but it was still there. So the Irish had a status, and the teaching of Irish was available as an optional subject in all Catholic schools. Irish was taught as an examination subject in grammar schools, and as a degree subject, mostly under the auspices of Celtic studies, in most of the third level institutions that were established in Ireland, including Queen's. And the government supported the language by paying training grants to independent Irish colleges, which were run by Conor na Gaeilge. That would be the summer colleges now, the Gaeltacht colleges that people have attended. They grew from, they were actually originally teacher training colleges set up, I suppose, in the early 1900s, but we'll come back to that. So the language, pre-1922, the language had a status and had protection throughout Ireland. Not perfect, but it was still there. When the new state was established in the North after partition, Unionists understood the importance of the Irish language for the nationalist community. It had a place in their eyes as a language in the education system and in academic life, and at the time it was supported to an extent by the Catholic Church. It was in this context that the first government of Northern Ireland began to give precedence and statutory powers to the political and cultural priorities of unionism. On the first day of February 1922, the management of educational services relating to the North, the counties which would make up Northern Ireland, was transferred from Dublin to Belfast. 2 days later, the Minister of Education for the North, Lord Londonderry, he was mentioned in one of the early speeches this morning, announced that special attention would be given to the cultural characteristics of the dominant class of Northern Ireland. Regarding the Irish language, he said it would become an optional subject as long as there were students who wanted it and teachers who would be able to teach it. Now that seems very reasonable. Okay, and he stated, "I would not be prepared to countenance any proposal containing any element of compulsion." Again, that all seems very reasonable. If there's teachers to teach it, etc. Can't really argue with that. However, on the 10th of August 1922, the Ministry began to develop other policy decisions relating to the language in the school system. And by April of the following year, the following decisions had been made. The post of Organiser of Irish Education was abolished. Irish was only permitted to be taught for 90 minutes per week, and recognition and funding of the independent Irish language colleges, i.e. teacher training colleges, was removed. So on one hand, in the year previous, the assertion had been, yes, if there are teachers qualified to teach it, we have no problem. That was okay. Then the following year, when things had settled, the funding was removed for these colleges. So it was a double whammy. In 1924, new rules were implemented regarding the teaching of Irish, and this goes to the other bit, if people want to. And Irish became an optional subject in the upper classes of the primary school system. Of the compulsory subjects, 2 subjects had to be chosen from the A list. That was history, science, natural studies or horticulture, before a student would be allowed to choose from the second list, in which Irish was. But the student had to choose between Irish, French, Latin, algebra or geometry. So yes, you're giving them a choice, but you're making them choose with subjects that were deemed to be extremely useful, algebra, geometry, etc. So the language wasn't being banned, but it was being very, very difficult for students to choose it. And things haven't changed that much. So therefore, between the years 1924 and 1927, the number of primary schools teaching Irish as an optional subject fell by 50%. Because of this, teachers had no choice but to make Irish available as an additional school subject with extra tuition fees, so taught for half an hour in the morning, lunchtime or after school. In 1926, the government banned the teaching of Irish in the 3rd and 4th standard, and there was a further decline of 70% of the number of pupils studying Irish. This is all evidenced in Prony. Anyone can access these. So therefore, between the years 1923 and 1926, the number of pupils studying Irish as a subject dropped from over 5,000 to 1,200. In 1934, the subsidy for Irish as an additional subject was also withdrawn. The view of Derek Chichester shows that there were two arguments against the teaching of Irish in the curriculum. Quote, "We must strongly object to the minds and brains of our children being burdened with such useless work, and we have still stronger objection to the teaching of that language being paid out of the public purse." When Coltasolu was founded in 1926, and that's the regional branch of Conor na Gaeilge, the Ulster branch of Conor na Gaeilge, a correspondence had begun with the Minister of Education, Lord Charlemont, and a special meeting was organised about teaching of Irish. Despite the fact the meeting was giving a hearing, a letter from Wilson Hungerford in the Northern Whig just highlights the prevailing view. Lord Charlemont is a minister of firmness and backbone, and the members of the Gaelic League have found he is neither to be cajoled nor threatened into doing something which would be, and this is the important line, subversive to the true educational interests of the province. The efforts of Coltasolu continued, and by the end of the year, the ministry decided that a new circular would be issued on the matter. If the members of Coltasolu were hopeful that there would be movement on the Irish language, there was no justification of the hope, since the following opinion came out from the ministry. "In the drafting of this circular, we should avoid carefully giving any impression we desire to encourage the teaching of the language." So, early in the 1920s and the early 1930s, it was made quite clear that the Irish language was going to face an uphill battle in our education system. Sorry, just keeping on time here. The 1930s provided a sort of an unsteady equilibrium. The situation didn't improve, but it sort of reached a balance regarding Irish in the education system. It was clear, however, that there was widespread view that the language was on its last legs in the north due to mass destruction in the education system in the 1920s. Because if we look at the response, Coltasolu had made a response in the early 1940s about more Irish to be heard in the BBC. And the local regional director, George Marshall, said, "The number of Gaelic speakers in Northern Ireland is negligible." True. And as far as schools are concerned, the proportion of these where the Irish language is taught is quite small and practically confined to secondary schools. Again, all true, but by design. As the 1930s progressed and the 40s, the teaching of Irish as it transpired, and this is how it would be for maybe the next 40 years, the future of Irish in the education was very limited. It's very difficult to find accurate statistics about the number of pupils or even the schools where Irish was taught during these years, but it's clear that we're really talking about grammar schools, that were run by the Catholic Church. In 1947, there were very few secondary schools, non-grammar. I think it was actually only two. And there was an attempt made to introduce an Irish class into the Strabane School of Technology. It was turned down, and the teacher was sacked. The quote by J.M. Andrews in 1940 shows the attitude that was now embedded in the government's mind. "You might point out that there are no Gaelic speakers in Northern Ireland, by which I assume is meant Erse or Irish." Okay, so this was the attitude towards the Irish language at the time. So this takes us to the 1940s, and to be honest, for the next probably 20 years or so, there was a status quo in Irish. Irish survived in English schools in the north, mostly in secondary schools, due to the goodwill of principals and the teachers and the efforts of organisations like Coltasolu and Gael Lynn, and I repeat, not much has changed. The main purpose of today's talk isn't to go back over this well-walked ground. Yeah, I've probably walked over it a bit too much already. But it's to present the current scenario, and just keep me on time, and to propose ways in which the Irish language can be developed within our education system to increase the number of daily speakers, and therefore to give them all and our society the benefits of bilingualism, benefits which are clear to all. So, what's the current state of play with Irish in the education system in the North? And there's a two-tiered system. You have the Irish medium sector, and you have Irish as a modern foreign language within the school system. So I'm going to begin on a very positive note, the Irish medium sector. Yesterday, Irish medium in Ireland as a whole celebrated 50 years in official existence at an event in Cavan. This is a huge milestone, and one that has been reached through the efforts of the Irish language sector and the bravery of parents, it must be said, to choose Irish medium education for their children. Much has been said about the growth of Irish medium education here in the North, from the radical movement, and I will use the word radical, and I'll use it in a very complimentary way because sometimes it can be thrown out disparagingly, but the radical movement in the Shaw's Road of the 1970s, which not only planted the seeds of Irish medium education here, but inspired a language revival, which is the envy of minority languages throughout the world. This moved on to the establishment of an Irish medium secondary sector. At present, there are approximately 7,000 pupils being educated through Irish in the North, and this is expected to grow to 10,000 over the next 5-6 years. The impact of the Irish medium sector has been huge, not only regarding the educational attainment of pupils and the benefits of bilingualism, but the Irish language communities that have sprung up as a result, and this is the key. The Shaw's Road Gaeltacht is now certainly in its 4th generation, quite possibly in its 5th, because I think there was a 5th generation baby born there quite recently. And it's very possible to spend one's working day in areas in Belfast solely through the medium of Irish due to the large number of speakers in the area. There are cafes, bars, sporting clubs in which Irish is the main spoken language, and the future of the language has been secured through the Irish medium sector in those areas. Similar Irish medium sectors have grown in Derry City and in Newry, and while not to the same extent, a community of speakers, and most importantly, a normalisation of the language in society has grown. And the Culterland on Great James Street in Derry and Gael Irish Vagardile in Newry is testament to that. 25 years ago, the rural area of Carntocher outside Mahara seemed to be in terminal decline. There were no facilities, no houses, and certainly no job opportunities. The establishment initially of an E-School, an Irish medium nursery school, and a Bunschool, an Irish medium primary school, has breathed new life into this community, with the wonderful Uncairn Centre providing post office services, a shop, a cafe, a concert hall, a recording studio, and many other micro businesses. These neo-Gaeltacht, and I hate the phrase, but yeah, you get where I'm at. These neo-Gaeltacht areas have grown from the seeds planted by Irish medium education. There are signs of these seeds growing in other areas too. Dungannon, Killile and Ballycastle have strong Irish medium schools, and it's not unusual, in fact it's becoming the norm, to meet speakers in these areas in every walk of life. It's clear, therefore, that the Irish medium education sector has a huge part to play in the growth of the Irish language. Children are exposed to the language from an early age, and it becomes part and parcel of their everyday lives, and by extension, the lives of those they come in contact with later years. And as I say, I have 2 daughters who are just proof of that. Can this be improved upon? Of course it can. The Irish medium sector still lags hugely in terms of resources. Much more could be done to help and incentivise parents to learn the language who have chosen this path for their children. Depending solely on the voluntary sector for this is not enough, much in the same way as people who work in local government in the south have opportunities to learn Irish so they can interact with the Irish-speaking public. As is unfortunately the norm in our society, Irish medium education meets with considerable opposition from certain political viewpoints. Politicians who seem to think that denying and hindering its development will strengthen their own identity and cultural aims, and ultimately votes, when the opposite has been proven again and again to be the case. One only has to look at the development of the Irish medium sector in East Belfast, and indeed the progression of new learners to 3rd level education due to learning Irish in night classes, to realise that the language is indeed for all and provides opportunities, and if I may say so, enlightenment to many aspects of our shared heritage which had previously been suppressed, denied and hidden. What of Irish within, what am I like for time?
7 minutes left.
I have 7 minutes left. I thought I'd only 5. There we go. Okay, I can slow down now. You don't have to wake up me. was a very fast Newry accent going there, so just slow it down. What of Irish then in the English medium sector? I talked about the Irish medium sector, so what about it in the education system? When we speak about Irish in schools, it's usually within the context of the secondary sector, although schemes have been launched recently to integrate Irish back into the primary school sector, but I'll come back to that later. Currently, there are 160 secondary schools that study the Northern Ireland curriculum, and Irish is offered, with emphasis on the word offered, in 68 of these schools, to various levels. Whilst many of these schools offer Irish to year 10, that's third year in old money, right? In a considerable number of cases, students have to choose their language before they start secondary school. So before coming into year 8 or first year, there are a number of schools where you have to make a call between Irish, French, Spanish. You may never have experienced the language before. It's very, very unfair to get a child to make that decision at such an early stage in life. At present, there are approximately 1,600 students each year who choose to study Irish for GCSE. This is a significant drop since the early 2000s, when the compulsion to study a language at GCSE was removed. And it must be stated for the record that this has had a huge impact on languages in general, not just Irish. Most of these schools will offer Irish to A-level, but this depends on the numbers who choose the language each year. And in many cases, students either have to opt for another subject or study Irish in the area learning partnerships, i.e. they travel to a host school to study the language because there isn't enough in their own school to have a class. On average, 450 students per year study Irish to AS, and this drops to around 300 at A2, with Irish the second most popular language choice at A-level behind Spanish. It overtook, actually, it's not true to say it overtook French last year. French undertook Irish, so this idea that, it was just bad reporting. Whilst these numbers may seem healthy, they have to be put into context. The Irish medium schools, secondary schools of College to Firstja and Gael College to Gira, that's the Belfast school and the Derry school, and the schools which have Irish medium streams like College to Katrina in Armagh, St Joseph Convent in Donaghmore and St Monica's Castlewellan, they account for approximately 100 of the students that do Irish to A-level. So without these, the actual picture is much more bleak in terms of students who've chosen to learn the language as a second language. It's also a popular misconception that Irish is vigorously promoted in Catholic/nationalist schools. I hate doing that, by the way, but I had to. For many teachers and principals, the language is an inconvenience, and the emphasis that's been placed on STEM subjects, which I have nothing against at all, have placed Irish and many other subjects in a pretty perilous position. The bottom line is that within the English medium sector, our students are not choosing to study Irish in huge numbers, and there's a crisis on the horizon. The current GCSE syllabus is not fit for purpose and hasn't been for many years, and many students perceive languages, in particular Irish, as being too difficult, and they may have a point, as one only has to look at the core vocabulary list to realise that those who are responsible for compiling such lists are very, very much out of touch with languages on the ground and how they should be spoken and taught. What can be done to address this? Well, there seems to be no appetite to make languages compulsory again, and whether one agrees with compulsory languages or not, to pursue this path would be a waste of energy and time. The key is to expose children to the language at an early stage, part immersion, whatever it may be. As I mentioned earlier, 2 new schemes have been launched by Gael Lynn and by the GAA to address this: Scoil Spreagtha, which means an inspired school, and Gaelic Sarang, which means Irish in the class. This is all based at primary schools. And these will both incorporate the teaching of Irish in English medium primary schools, and as was seen by a pilot scheme in Derry earlier this year, this should have a positive impact on the uptake of the language. The Primary Modern Languages programme was established in 2007 and was a huge success, but this was ended in 2015 due to budgetary constraints within the Department of Education. When the budgetary constraints is usually an excuse for it doesn't suit a certain political agenda, unfortunately. The money can be found when it's needed, and when something doesn't say, when it doesn't tick a box, then suddenly money becomes the issue. But that's another rant for another day. In a recent email contact between myself and our Minister for Education, our designated Minister for Education, it was very, very clear that there are no plans to reintroduce the primary languages scheme. The cynical part of me would say that this particular portfolio is scared this may improve a lot for Irish, but again, I have to take the email on its word. It's long been accepted that Gaeltacht courses in the summer are key to helping students fall in love with the Irish language and fall in love with each other too, because there's a lot of romances happened there, as I've just witnessed myself at home. Much more needs to be done to make these courses accessible for all, whether this be the financial incentives of schemes like LIFA or Colta Solo and Gael Lynn's long-running scholarship schemes, or indeed creating bespoke courses for children who can't, for various reasons, attend in the normal way. We need to attract children from backgrounds that can't afford to go to the Gaeltacht. There's no point giving scholarships to somebody who's already going. They're going to be going anyway. We need to be targeting children from disadvantaged backgrounds. We need to be targeting children from new communities and saying to them in September, here's a bursary for you to go, instead of it just being spent money for a child who's going to get going anyway. What am I like? 2 minutes? Time up? I'll rattle. This is all I need. What about Irish third level education, adult education? Irish is offered and studied in both our third level educations and continues to be popular, but requires constant work and recruitment. Many students opt for St Mary's Teacher Training College, which takes in around 30 students per year, and the various degree courses in Queen's, 20 to 25. Ulster University is the largest provider of education in Irish at third level, with around 70-80 entries each year between its diploma, degree and postgraduate courses. That was a great plug there, wasn't it? The third level provision is adequate, I'll admit, but like everything else, it could be improved upon. Irish in combination with other subjects is vital for sustaining and developing the language community. And while some efforts have been made to introduce courses such as law with Irish, the real need is for training teachers for specialist subjects who can deliver through Irish. There's a significant need for Irish speakers in childcare settings, special needs, speech therapy, and many other areas which would greatly enhance the Irish language in society. I'm on my last paragraph here. There is, of course, a very healthy adult education sector, with thousands, and I do mean thousands, attending Irish language classes throughout the north. This is an area which is deserving of research and which, if standardised and supported, will add significantly to the language in society. So to conclude, I hope I've given a clear overview of Irish within our education system and a bit of a historical context to explain how we got here and how language benefits our society, and hope that I've made proposals to improve this. If the limits of our language means the limits of our world, learning a new language should foster a richer, fuller and more balanced view of life. Learning a new language opens up new perspectives on the world, and in doing so, cultivates an enhanced degree of tolerance and cultural awareness. So let education be the path to this and the path to enlightenment. Gormaigh.
Gormaigh now. I think that the rise of the Irish language movement and the education system is something which you can be very proud of, and I think it just shows you how